The Capital Confidential podcast is brought to you by the Times-Union, the leading newspaper in New York's capital region. Subscribe today or visit online at timesunion.com.
You want to deport an undocumented person? Start with me, because I'm an undocumented person.
How do we beat him in an election?
We will. I'm going to run against him.
I wish you would. I wish you would, Dad. I would.
There are things in here that are unobjectionable because they're not that effective. So yeah, sure, I'll vote for a distinctive license plate. Sure, why not?
Jim, you had your press conference at 4 o'clock.
You're having a press conference now?
That's
You're
right.
talking?
I'm having a press conference.
Well,
now.
is this your space here or is it public?
No, it's my space.
Oh, this is your
Don't
space.
interrupt.
Okay.
I'm David Lombardo, and this is the Capital Confidential podcast. This episode features Budget Talk with David Friedfel of the Citizens Budget Commission, which recently released a report calling into question the governor's claim that spending this year was capped at 2%. We also talked about future budget deficits, the failing New York Mets, transparency legislation, and our idea for a spin-off podcast. I began by asking about the claim pushed by Andrew Cuomo, his press shop, and the DOB that the budget restricted state spending to 2%.
So they're basing it on state operating spending, which is a specific definition of state spending. It's a pretty encompassing measure of state expenditures. The issue is that it's not necessarily the most accurate reflection of state spending on a year-to-year basis, because certain things move in and out of state operating spending, which in and of itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. The issue is that when you're calculating growth, it should reflect kind of things being treated the same way across years. Otherwise, you end up with a warped growth rate, which is what happens here.
So are you saying, David, and I'm prepared to have my mind blown, that there are more types of spending than just state operating spending?
There are. There's capital spending, which is outside of the definition, which makes sense because capital spending is something that you would usually, kind of analyze over a longer period of growth, a longer period of the capital investments, whether it be, bridges and roads or buildings, and also federal spending, which is outside of state operating spending. And that also makes sense because there's certain federal monies that just flow through the state. They hit the state's books and then go right back out, and it wouldn't necessarily make sense to really include those because the state doesn't have a lot of control or impact in how that money is used. What aren't included are certain things that get moved either off budget completely, moved between years. There's some changes there that happen. And sometimes things move from a spending to a tax expenditure, which is one of the pieces we pick up. The state's treatment of the STAR program. Currently, if you enroll in the STAR program, a new homeowner, you get it as a check to you from the state, but it's technically a personal income tax benefit, rebate, or a credit. So it comes out of the revenue side as opposed to I've owned my home for a little while, so I get my STAR benefit. It counts as spending, and yours counts as a tax benefit. So yours doesn't count against the 2% growth cap. Mine does for some reason.
Will this dynamic shift even more as people continue to buy homes?
So in fiscal year, and this has been going on for a couple of years now, fiscal year 18, there's about $780 million in STAR that was counted this way as the tax credit. And in fiscal year 19, it's estimated to be $862 million. So it's about an $84 million increase in that money that's shifting from one type of STAR to the other type of STAR. And when you're calculating state operating spending growth, it almost looks like savings, but it's just a change in how it's being spent.
And what about shifting to off-budget accounts? What does that mean?
The biggest one that they've done in recent years, and the biggest one in this year's budget, is changing the way that they're counting the Metropolitan Commuter Transportation Mobility Tax.
And for people who live north of Westchester County, what does that mean?
Well, it's actually north of Orange County.
North of Orange County, wow. I just took a stab at where the upstate, downstate line was, but, that's for greater minds than ours to decide, I guess.
Certainly, and it would take way more than one podcast to discern.
Right.
So it's a payroll tax that's levied on all people who work in the MTA region, which is Orange County and South. And it brings in about $1.5 billion per year. In the fiscal year 2018 budget, which ended April 1st, or March 31st it ended, it counted as state collected it, and then the state appropriated it to the MTA. So the state was almost a pass-through to a large extent. It kind of came in and went right out to the MTA. They decided to change how that's counted. Instead of counting as state spending, it's now just going to go directly to the MTA, which I think is justifiable for a number of reasons. It actually helps the MTA's bond rating because now it's not that receipt is no longer subject to appropriation. They don't have to worry about the state legislature deciding to do something or anything like that. The money flows straight to the MTA. They also got an extra $60 million in this upcoming year because there's kind of a process to get the money to go through the state. Now it's going straight to them. So there are many benefits to doing that. But one of the big drawbacks is that now when the State Division of Budget calculates budget growth, they take that $1.5 billion out of fiscal year 19, and it looks, if when you're just looking at state operating spending, like somehow spending decreased by $1.5 billion in that area, and it didn't. It's just going through a different way, and it allows them to say that state operating spending is growing by just that move alone by 1.5 percentage points less than it actually is.
And were there any cash disbursements shift between fiscal years or other spending items that were reclassified?
There was. In the legislature, the state has done this a number of times in the past as it relates to debt service prepayments. Instead of paying debt service in April, let's say they'll pay it in the prior March, which kicks it into the previous fiscal year, and it allows them to kind of play around a little bit with growth rates. Usually you would think that prepaying your debt sooner, or paying your debt sooner would accrue some savings. It's only the debt service, so it doesn't actually provide any real savings. It just shifts when that money is going out the door and allows them to kind of play around a little bit there with the growth rates.
So why should we care? I mean, what's, besides them fudging, the 2% or 4%, whatever it might actually be, why should anybody care?
Well, I think that the big issue is really the question of transparency. So when you hear that the state budget is growing by only 2%, and I think most people think of inflation, 2 to 3%. Anything less than that, you think, well, all right, they're doing a good job with containing spending, and you hear about all these great new programs the state is doing with the Excelsior College Scholarship and all these other things. And spending is growing by more than that. It's growing by 4.5%, and that's a little more significant. I think particularly when it's being trumpeted so much that containing spending, it's important to know that they're not containing spending by quite as much as they're saying they are.
Would the DOB or anybody, the Cuomo's administration, push back at all? I mean, would they say this is all, accepted practices? These are all legal ways of looking at things, and, other accountants would say, nah, David Friedfel, you guys are the ones who aren't thinking about this correctly.
I think they would push back a little bit. We've done this kind of analysis before, and there certainly has been some pushback. But in the financial plan itself, and we highlight this in the blog, DOB acknowledges that certain, and this is a quote, that certain actions have affected or intended to affect the amount of annual spending accounted for in state operating funds basis of reporting. And then a couple sentences later, it says an annual spending growth in state operating funds would be higher than current projections absent those actions. So DOB acknowledges that this is what's happening and what they're doing, and they don't shy away from it when you read the details of the financial plan. The issue is that most people don't read the details of the financial plan. That's left to folks like me and you. Most people just see the press release, which says state spending kept at 2% for the 8th consecutive year. And one thing we point out is I've gone back and I've tried to crunch similar numbers for past years, particularly in the beginning part of the Cuomo years and throughout. And they basically did abide by the 2% up until last year. Last year was the first year where they really went above it. I mean, there were a couple of years where if you kind of move things back to where they were originally supposed to be spent, maybe it'd be 2.1 one year and then 1.8 the following year, things like that. But this is the last two. This current year and the prior year are the first 2 years where they've really kind of moved away from that.
What did state spending do in previous years before the Cuomo administration? Was it around 2%? Was it higher? Was it lower?
It was definitely higher than 2% in most years. We haven't gone back and kind of moved all of the spending around, and there are certain types of things where you could say because they weren't so focused on state operating spending that they may have done things differently. For instance, the commuter tax, which you talked about before, when that was first instituted, it would have made it look like suddenly state operating spending increased drastically when the state wasn't really spending any more money. It was just this new tax that was imposed for the benefit of the MTA.
You mentioned the financial plan, which takes a look also to the future and makes some projections about budget deficits moving forward. Can you talk a little bit about what the financial plan that came out recently says about budget deficits? When
the executive budget came out in January and then was updated again in February, it had next year's budget deficit, so fiscal year 2019-2020, had a deficit of about $3.5 billion. In the adopted budget report that just came out in May, that had increased by $550 million up to over $4 billion for the gap. And that's a lot of money to close. And the way the governor closes it, kind of, or tries to close it a bit, in the financial plan, it says that no matter what happens, we're going to keep state spending to 2%, which we just talked about how it's not really 2% once you really dig into it. And that is going to cover up most of the savings, or, allow them to come up with most of the savings. And then after that, they'll still have $780 million to make up. And those numbers increase in the out years. The 3-year budget gap all combined is about $18 billion, and that grows from when, just a few short months before the budget was adopted, they said it was going to be less than $14 billion. So it increased by about 30%, which is disconcerting.
What contributes to those out-year budget gaps?
There are a couple of things. A number of the governor's savings proposals weren't adopted, things like some things in Medicaid and kind of a number of those pieces, and a number of the revenue proposals also were not adopted. It was frequently called the Amazon tax, but the Internet Fairness Sales Tax was not adopted, and that would have provided a couple $100 million over those periods. The financial plan also assumes the expiration of the millionaire's surcharge, which is an additional personal income tax. The rate goes from 6.85 to 8.82, over $2 million for a couple. And that's supposed to expire, so it would revert back to that 6.85 number. About $4.5 billion per year, and that's supposed to expire in December of 2019. And the current financial plan assumes that that's going to expire, which is kind of one of the reasons why the deficits increase considerably in the out years. And given what's happened recently at the federal level with the cap on state and local tax deductions, we think it's pretty important that they allow that surcharge to expire, because New York's competitiveness has been really impinged because of those federal actions.
The state has also put out some long-term numbers on economic development spending. What do they look like?
On economic development, they're specifically under Empire State Development. Fiscal year 19, they say they have appropriations of $1.3 billion, which is quite a bit for economic development, and most of that is funded with debt authority bonds, which is particularly concerning to us.
Why is it concerning?
Many of these programs, you're not getting we don't believe you're getting a huge rate of return, and because you're issuing debt, not only is it bad spending, but it means that the state is going to have to continue to pay those bills down the line for forever, how long that debt may be taken for. And for some of these programs, it's questionable whether or not the state should be issuing debt for them at all. I mean, the state's it's estimated to do $150 million for the regional councils, $8 million for the Market New York program. Does the state really need to issue debt in order to pay for marketing? It seems like that should be the type of thing where if you can't pay for it with cash, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it. There's a $600 million life sciences lab, but most of that's actual capital. That's something where there'll be a building afterwards. There's a better justification there.
What should be next on our budget radar? We're only, I guess, we're in the second month of the new fiscal year, but are there any other reports, any other financial plans that are coming around the corner? What's next on the state budget calendar?
The mid-year financial plan update is the next one that I'm really looking to see, because that actually will come out after the election, or almost definitely after the election. Technically, it's supposed to come out the end of October, but it almost always comes out a couple weeks into November, and that's where you'll have a much better idea of what the federal government is going to do. The IRS just said they're going to issue regulations regarding the state's charitable workaround on the state and local tax cap. So those regulations will be out by then, and you'll be able to see whether or not people have started making those decisions to make those charitable contributions. You'll also see where the gap is, and you have a much better read on personal income tax collections at that point in the year. So that's kind of the next big one. There's a first quarter update but that one's usually not quite as meaty. So the post-election financial plan update is the one that I'm looking for. And then also making sure that the legislature doesn't do anything, add any additional spending before they leave town in a month. Where, in a few years ago, they added a bunch of rebates as they were kind of leaving Albany, and we're hoping that they don't pile anything on their way out the door.
Well, I guess while I've got you, there's 3 weeks left in the session, and you guys have been keeping a scorecard of economic development sweeteners and I believe pension sweeteners, right?
Yes.
And anything on the big scoreboard?
We've been monitoring all the economic development bills that would enhance economic development spending or increase economic development spending. But what we're really hoping to see up on that scoreboard in the Assembly is a database of deals and also the state comptroller's program bill to restore many of his oversight over economic development spending. If we can get those two things passed through the Assembly, the Senate already passed them. I think that would be a great move forward for New York State to increase economic development disclosure and also make it so that people like me and you can look and see whether or not the state is getting value for its economic development investments and put that out there for the public to know about.
Were you surprised that the Senate finally moved those two bills?
Not really, because the Senate and the Assembly both had passed a version of the database of deals in their one House budgets. The Senate moved a database of deals forward. I don't remember if it actually passed the Senate or if it was kind of close at the end of last year. And it's something I've talked to their staff about it, and it's something that many of the senators really want to see done. So I wasn't too surprised. I think some of the politics kind of played out in a slightly different way this year, where they were able to push both through.
David, are you telling me that the Senate Republicans, in an attempt to try to stick it to the governor, passed accountability measures? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
I don't know if they were trying to stick it to the governor, or if perhaps in years past they were doing some favors by not passing bills that the governor didn't want to see. But we're certainly glad to see that they passed it this year, and we really hope the Assembly does the same.
Is there any appetite in the Assembly for this kind of effort?
I think so. I think there's certainly from a policy perspective, I think there's always a desire in both houses of the legislature, I think, to see more disclosure of spending, so that they can point to things and say, hey, this is working, this is a good thing, and where things aren't, I certainly hope they want the disclosure so that they can get rid of things that are not working. The political calculation in the Assembly is obviously different than that in the Senate.
I'll be following the scorecard for those final 3 weeks of session to see what the final tally is, and love to check in with you when we get the mid-year report, if not sooner. I always got to find out what your favorite show that's being produced with the film tax credit is, and just I think we do have to do a separate podcast just to reviews based on what the state is financing. I think that's just a good idea.
That sounds good, except it's baseball season, so I'm pretty focused on the Mets most of the time, which is a horror movie all by itself.
Did taxpayers help fund Citi Field or something? Otherwise, I don't know why I would care.
There was, I think we actually did on some infrastructure stuff, but certainly not the way we haven't fallen down the trap that other states have of full financing of stadiums, which is fortunate. Although we do spend about $7 million per year to give to the Buffalo Bills so that they'll stay in Buffalo.
And that's our show. My thanks to David Friedfel for spending some time with me. You can keep up with his work and everything from the Citizen Budget Commission by visiting cbcny.org. And it must be good stuff because they have a .org website. Please keep up with my written work and everything else from the Times-Union's Capitol Bureau by visiting the Capitol Confidential blog. And make sure to subscribe to the show wherever you download podcasts, including iTunes, Google Play, and TuneIn. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes. It helps other people discover the show and could help lower that 1-star review we got, which described the podcast as, quote, a little disappointing, end quote. Seems more like very disappointing for a 1-star review. But I digress. Until next time, podcast adjourned.
Just heard I tried to get you.
This day sucks.